Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going behind the numbers to take a look at how statistics can be manipulated to mislead. And for this one, we are using Daryl Huff's How to Lie with Statistics as our guide.
It's pretty amazing how relevant Huff's work still is, even though it was written back in 1954.
Yeah, it's a classic. All right, so the book dives right into this concept of a representative sample, which is like the foundation of good statistics. Huff gives the example of a study that said Yale graduates from the class of 24 were making bank like a super high average income.
Yeah, but there was a problem with that. The
Oh.
researchers had trouble finding all the graduates, especially the ones who may not have been doing so well. So their sample ended up being biased toward the higher earners, and that painted a really misleading picture of the average income.
That's wild. It shows just how important it is to understand how data was collected. If the sample isn't actually representative of the group as a whole, then the conclusions you make from it can be way off.
Exactly, and it's not always easy to spot a biased sample.
Huh.
Take random sampling, for example, where everyone in the population should have an equal chance of being selected. But in reality, achieving true randomness is really difficult.
Oh, so like even if you're trying to be fair, there's still a chance of accidentally creating a biased sample.
Absolutely. That's why other methods like stratified sampling exist, where you divide the population into groups and then randomly select from each group to try and make sure you have a representative sample. It's more complex, but it helps reduce bias.
Yeah, that makes sense. This all reminds me of that big polling mistake back in 1936 when the Literary Digest predicted Alf Landon would crush FDR in the presidential election. And they were so wrong.
Oh yeah, their sample was the problem. They used a lot of telephone directories and magazine subscriber lists, which during the Great Depression meant that their sample was skewed towards the wealthier, Republican-leaning voters. That gave them a completely wrong picture of what the overall voters were like.
So the lesson is always check out how this sample was chosen, because if it seems skewed, then be careful about trusting the results.
Exactly. And while we're on the topic of skewed results, Huff also talks about how the word average can be a tricky thing in statistics.
Right. He uses the example of a small business to show how different types of averages, like the mean, median, and mode, can create totally different pictures of the same data. Like, say the owner's making a big salary, like $25,000, and then all the other employees are making way less, around like $2,000 each.
Right. If you only look at the mean salary, it might seem like everyone's doing great, but that's just because the owner's high income is throwing things off. The median salary, though, which is like the middle value when you put all the salaries in order, would be much closer to what most of the employees are actually making.
So you're saying that the average can be misleading depending on which average they're actually using? Kind of like that saying, there are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics.
Exactly. It's super important to know which average is being used and if it actually reflects what's typical in the data. Like, let's say you're looking at average home prices. If there are a bunch of really expensive mansions in a neighborhood, the average price can get inflated, making it seem like the area is less affordable than it is for most people.
I'm definitely starting to see how easy it is to twist these numbers. So what other tricks does Huff expose?
Well, he also talks about something he calls the little figures that are not there.
Hmm. Okay, what's that?
It's all about how leaving out important information like the sample size or if something is statistically significant can lead to misleading conclusions.
Okay, I think I get that. It's like when you see a toothpaste ad that says 23% fewer cavities, but it doesn't say how many people they tested it on or how they did the testing.
Precisely. Without those missing figures, the claim doesn't mean much. Maybe they only tested a few people. Or the difference in cavities was so small that it really doesn't mean much.
So even if a statistic sounds impressive at first glance, it's important to dig a bit deeper and look for the details.
Absolutely. You should always be careful about claims that leave out important information, especially those scientific studies they show in ads that forget to tell you how many people were in the study or how it was actually done.
Okay, I'll keep an eye out for that. So far, we've talked about biased samples, misleading averages, and missing information, but it sounds like there's more.
Oh, definitely. And it looks like Huff doesn't stop there.
What's next on his list of ways to mess with statistics?
Well, next, he moves into the visual side of things. He talks about how people can manipulate graphs to make trends look bigger or smaller than they actually are, basically tricking viewers. He calls this the gee whiz graph, and it's all about using visual tricks to create a distorted view of the data.
Haha, I think I've fallen for those before. Like in those infomercials where they have those crazy before and after photos, they're like masters of making things look more dramatic than they are.
Exactly. One common tactic is to shorten the y-axis, which is the vertical axis on a graph. By cutting off the lower part of the axis, even small changes can look much bigger than they really are.
So it's not just about the numbers, it's also about how they show them to you.
Exactly. Always pay attention to the axes, the scale, and the overall context of the graph before you jump to any conclusions. And be careful about those dramatic visuals that seem more designed to make you feel something rather than give you accurate information.
Good points. All right, so far we've covered biased samples, misleading averages, missing information, and tricky graphs. What other tricks does Huff talk about?
Well, he gets into another visual tactic called the one-dimensional picture, where people use images to represent data and sometimes do it in misleading ways.
Oh, I think I've seen those before. Like those infographics that use stacks of money to show differences in income or illustrations that use differently sized people to show population growth.
Right. But the problem is that it's easy to manipulate those images to make the data look different from what it actually is. Huff gives this great example comparing the average weekly wage in England and Rotundia.
Interesting. Okay, tell me more.
They used an image of a money bag for Rotundia that was only half as tall as the money bag for England, which made it seem like the Rotundian worker was earning a lot less.
So far, so good, but I'm guessing there's more to it.
You bet. They also made the Rotundian money bag half as wide. So it looked like there was a 2-to-1 difference in wages, but really it was 4-to-1 when you look at the actual area of the money bags.
That's sneaky. So it's not enough to just look at the images. We've also got to pay attention to how they're sized and if that accurately represents the data.
Absolutely. Huff gives another example from the Iron and Steel Institute, where they used pictures of blast furnaces to show how much their steelmaking capacity had grown. They drew the blast furnace representing the 1940s much bigger than the one representing the 1930s.
I bet they made it bigger in all dimensions, not just taller, right?
You got it. They made it look like the capacity had increased way more than it actually had. So whenever you see images being used to represent data, just be careful. Look closely at the size of those images and ask yourself if they really reflect the numbers.
This is really making me think twice about every infographic I've ever seen. So we've got to watch out for biased samples, misleading averages, missing information, manipulative graphs, and deceptive images. Anything else to be wary of?
You bet. Huff also dives into this really interesting tactic he calls the semi-attached figure.
Okay, what's that one?
It's all about using impressive-sounding numbers that don't actually have much to do with what they're talking about. Like imagine a juice extractor that's advertised as being 26% more efficient.
Yeah, that would probably get me interested.
But the trick is that it was 26% more efficient than an old hand-cranked juicer. Of course, it's more efficient than that, but that comparison doesn't really mean anything to someone buying a juicer today.
Ah, so it's all about making it seem like there's a connection where there really isn't one.
Exactly. You see this all the time where they use statistics that sound good but don't actually relate to what they're trying to say. Another example from Huff is a company that was bragging about how long their light bulbs last. They said their bulbs last an average of 2,000 hours based on tests.
Okay, but I bet there's a catch.
You're right. It turned out they ran the light bulbs at a lower voltage during the tests to make them last longer, which isn't how people usually use them.
So it's not enough to just look at the numbers themselves. We also have to think about if they're even relevant to what they're claiming.
Exactly. Don't be fooled by statistics that sound amazing if they don't really have anything to do with the topic at hand.
Okay, lots to think about here. So we've got biased samples, misleading averages, missing information, manipulative graphs, deceptive images, and now irrelevant figures. What other statistical traps does Huff talk about?
Well, next he talks about one of the most common and sneaky statistical fallacies, assuming that just because two things happen together, one must cause the other.
Yeah, that one. I've definitely heard people say things like that, like how video games cause violence, even though there's really no proof.
Exactly. Just because two things are correlated doesn't mean one causes the other. There could be another reason, or it could just be random chance. Huff uses a funny example to illustrate this: the correlation between the number of storks nesting on rooftops and birth rates.
Wait, storks and babies, what's the connection there?
Well, in areas with more births, you might also see more storks around. But it's not like the storks are bringing the babies. It's more likely that bigger houses attract more storks, and those same bigger houses also tend to have bigger families.
So it's just a coincidence, not a cause and effect situation.
Precisely. He also gives a more serious example: the correlation between college education and income. People with college degrees usually earn more, but that doesn't necessarily mean going to college caused them to earn more. It could be the people who can afford college often come from families with more resources and connections, which helps them get better jobs regardless of their education.
So how can we avoid falling for this trap?
Just be careful about claims that suggest a direct cause and effect relationship just because two things happen together. Always ask yourself, are there other possible explanations? Could something else be affecting the results?
Okay, I'll definitely keep that in mind. So we've got to be careful about jumping to conclusions about cause and effect just because two things are correlated. It sounds like Huff doesn't just point out these problems, though. He also gives some advice on how to fight back, right?
You're absolutely right, he does. In the next chapter, he goes beyond just pointing out individual tricks and gets into the whole idea of how you can manipulate data to get the result you want. It's like taking all those tools we've talked about and using them to create a masterpiece of deception. He calls this how to statisticulate.
Whoa, that sounds pretty intense. Can you give me an example of what statisticulation looks like?
Sure, imagine a company that brags about increasing its profits by 50%.
That sounds pretty impressive.
It does. But what if their profits were super tiny to begin with? Then a 50% increase might not be as amazing as it sounds. They've just played with the numbers to make themselves look better than they are.
So percentages can be tricky too. What else can they manipulate?
Well, they can play around with baselines. They might shift the starting point to make changes look bigger than they really are. For example, a politician might try to take credit for a drop in unemployment, even though unemployment was already going down because of other things happening in the economy. They're basically taking credit for something that was already going to happen anyway.
Or like a company that wants to make it look like they pay their employees more than they actually do. They might include bonuses and stuff in the average wage, even though most employees don't get those.
Exactly. It's all about manipulating the numbers to tell the story they want to tell. Always look for context, how they got those numbers, and what their motivations might be. Remember, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Okay, so we really have to be on the lookout for this kind of trickery everywhere. But before we get too paranoid, I think it's time to talk about those tools Huff gives us to fight back. What does he say about that?
Don't worry, he doesn't leave us feeling helpless. In the last chapter, he gives readers 5 key questions to ask whenever they see a statistic. He calls it how to talk back to a statistic.
Okay, I'm ready. Give me those questions. I'm ready to fight back against those sneaky statisticians.
Here we go. Who says so? How do they know? What's missing? Did somebody change the subject? Does it make sense? These questions are like a lie detector test for statistics.
I love it. I can already feel myself getting more skeptical and careful about what I believe.
That's the point. It's all about being an active participant in understanding information, not just passively accepting whatever people tell you.
I like that a lot. Now that we have those 5 powerful questions in our toolbox, I'd love to see how we can use them in real-life situations. Do you have any examples of how we could apply those questions to news stories, ads, or even just everyday conversations?
Of course. I think it would be helpful to look at some specific examples and see how we can use Huff's framework to break them down. Let's do that next.
Sounds good. But I think it's time for a quick break before we get into that. We'll be back in a flash.
Okay, we're back, and I'm ready to start using those 5 questions. I'm feeling like a stats detective, ready to uncover some sneaky tricks.
Uh-huh. That's the attitude. Knowledge is power, right? And by understanding these tactics, we can all be smarter about the information we come across.
So let's dive into those questions. The first one is, who says so? It's all about thinking about the source and whether they might be biased.
Right. It's kind of like evaluating an expert witness in a trial. You'd want to know their credentials, experience, and if they have any conflicts of interest, right? Well, we should do the same thing when we're looking at statistics.
Okay, so we're looking for information about funding sources, if the researchers are connected to any particular groups, and anything that might make them want to twist the results. Yeah, exactly. Like a study that's funded by a company that would benefit from the results is going to be less trustworthy than a study that's done by an independent group.
Right, that makes sense. The second question is, how do they know? Which I guess means looking at how they did the study. I'll admit, this is where I sometimes get a little lost.
It's true. Research methodology can be complicated. But even understanding the basics can help you figure out if the claims they're making are valid. Like, was it a randomized controlled trial, which is supposed to be the best kind of study? Or was it just an observational study where you can only see that 2 things are related, but not that one causes the other?
So even if the findings sound really interesting, we need to know how they actually got those findings.
Absolutely. A big, well-designed, randomized controlled trial is a lot more convincing than a small study that wasn't designed as well. And if they're being vague about how they did the study, that's a big red flag.
Okay, good to know. The third question is what's missing, which reminds us to look for important information that they might have left out on purpose or maybe by accident. This is where those sneaky little details can hide.
Right. It's like those commercials that say 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this toothpaste. But what they don't tell you is they only asked 10 dentists and they all work for the toothpaste company.
Uh-huh. Oh, wow. Okay, so we should look for details about how many people were in the study, what the margin of error is, if the results were statistically significant, and anything else that could be affecting the results.
Exactly. And remember, sometimes not giving you information can be just as misleading as giving you wrong information. If they're not telling you something important, there's probably a reason.
Okay, good point. On to question number 4. Did somebody change the subject? This one is about looking for those sneaky shifts in baselines or unfair comparisons that they use to make results look more exciting than they really are.
Yeah, it's like when a politician tries to take credit for the deficit going down when really it was already going down because of things happening in the economy. They're basically taking credit for something that was going to happen anyway.
Or a company that says their product is like 50% better than the competition, but they're not really clear about what they're measuring or what better even means.
Exactly. Always double-check the baseline and the comparisons they're making. Are those numbers actually related to the claim they're making? Are the comparisons fair?
Okay, that makes sense. And finally, we have question number 5. Does it make sense? I like this one because it reminds us to trust our gut and use our common sense. Sometimes a statistic just feels wrong, even if you can't explain why.
That's a good point. It's about using your intuition and what you already know about the world to decide if something sounds believable. If the statistic sounds crazy or just doesn't fit with what you know about how things work, it's probably a good idea to look into it more.
Like that classic example about ice cream sales and drownings. Just because they both happen more in the summer doesn't mean one causes the other, right? Obviously, hot weather is the reason for both.
Exactly. More people eat ice cream and go swimming when it's hot, and that's why there are more drownings. It's not because of the ice cream. We need to be careful about those simple explanations that don't really take into account how complicated the world actually is.
So if we use these 5 questions, we can be more aware of those statistical tricks and less likely to fall for them. It's like having a set of tools to help us think critically.
That's exactly it. It's about taking an active role in understanding information and not just believing everything you hear.
I love it. Now that we have these 5 questions, I'm curious to see how we can actually use them. Do you have any examples of how we could apply them to things like news stories, advertisements, or even just regular conversations?
Of course. I think it would be really helpful to take a look at some real-life examples and use Huff's ideas to analyze them. Let's get into that now.
Okay, we're back, and I'm ready for some real-world examples. Let's put those 5 questions to work.
All right, let's do it. Remember, the more we know about how stats can be used and abused, the better we are at navigating all the information out there.
Exactly. So give me an example. Where might we see some of these statistical shenanigans in real life?
Well, let's say you're scrolling through social media and you see an ad for like a new brain-boosting supplement that claims to increase your IQ by 10 points.
Ooh, tempting. But before I go by it, let's see if it passes those 5 question tests. First up, who says so?
Right. Is this claim based on a real scientific study from a reputable journal? Or is it just a bunch of random people saying it worked for them? We need to know who's behind the claim and if they have any reason to be biased.
So I should look for information about the company, the researchers, and any financial connections between them.
Exactly. If they only have testimonials and personal stories, that's not very convincing. Those could be powerful, but they're not the same as real scientific evidence.
Okay, so next is, how do they know? This is where we look at how they did the study.
Right. Did they use a double-blind, placebo-controlled study? That's when neither the people in the study nor the researchers know who's getting the real thing and who's getting a fake pill. That's like the gold standard for making sure there's no bias.
And did they have enough people in the study from different backgrounds so it applies to a lot of people? A study with just a few people or a group that's all the same might not be relevant to everyone else.
Exactly. You also want to think about other things that might be affecting the results. For instance, what if people who already really want to improve their brain power are more likely to try the supplement? That could skew the results.
I see, I see. Okay, so question 3 is, what's missing?
Yeah, we got to watch out for important information that they might not tell us, maybe on purpose or maybe not. Like maybe the study did find that IQ scores went up, but the change was so small it doesn't really matter.
Or maybe there were bad side effects they didn't mention. We need the whole picture, not just the good parts.
Exactly. Remember, not giving you information can be just as misleading as giving you the wrong information. If they're being shady about something, there's usually a reason.
True. All right, question 4 is, did somebody change the subject? Here we look for those sneaky changes in the baseline or comparisons that make things look better than they are.
Yeah, like what if the supplement company compares their product to a placebo, but they make the placebo on purpose really weak or something that makes people feel bad?
Or maybe they cherry pick the data, only showing you the good stuff and hiding the bad stuff. It's all about making things look a certain way to tell a particular story.
Exactly. Always look closely at the comparisons they're making and the data they're showing you. Are they being fair and honest? Or are they trying to trick you?
Good points.
Huh.
And finally, we have question number 5. Does it make sense? I like this one. It's all about using your common sense and thinking about if the claim actually sounds believable.
Right? If a statistic sounds crazy or just doesn't seem right based on what you know about the world, trust your gut. Don't be afraid to be skeptical, especially when someone's making a really big claim.
Like, for example, if they say chewing a certain gum will make you lose weight, I'm pretty sure that's not how weight loss works. Yep.
Exactly. It's about using your own judgment and knowledge to think about the information you're getting.
This has been really eye-opening. So while we've been talking about this brain supplement, these 5 questions can really be used for anything, right?
Oh, absolutely. You could use them for news stories, what politicians say, advertisements, scientific studies, really anything.
It's like having a superpower for spotting BS. I'm already feeling more confident and aware.
I love it. Remember, a healthy dose of skepticism is your best weapon against statistical manipulation. Don't be afraid to question what you see and hear, especially when it comes to numbers.
Well, thank you so much for all this information. I feel like I've learned a ton about the power of statistics and how they can be twisted.
You're very welcome. It's been great chatting with you about this. And remember, stay curious and keep asking questions.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. And remember, stay curious, stay critical, and we'll see you next time.